Chapter 12 of the Dalehouse Murder by Francis Everton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganand. The Dalehouse Murder. Chapter 12. Janet arrives on the scene. A beauty gazes with a smile of pleasurable anticipation into some distorted mirror to start back in horror from the grinning image that greets her so unexpectedly. But were little Alport to gaze into a distorted mirror, what then? What unthinkable monstrosity might he not see depicted? And so it was with my dreams, and the way they reflected my already gruesome waking thoughts as I dreamed and woke intermittently through what remained of that hot, airless night. If the day had seemed long, those few hours of dream-disturbed sleep were like a slice of eternity itself. An eternity which I occupied in playing tennis at the club, serving through an interminable game, first with a baby flagon of Chinese poison, and then with my own severed hand, which Margaret handed to me on a racket like a ball. In racing frantically from room to room to find Ethel, then the Tundish, then each of the others in turn, lying dead on their backs with staring, bloodshot eyes. All dead, and myself alone with the dead, alone and tearing desperately from one room to the next to find a sign of life. Thumping madly on resounding doors, crouching, shrinking down outside them, opening them in fear, and banging them to again in terror when I saw what there was within, looking furtively behind me to see little Alport standing there grinning sardonically, leering at me, dangling a pair of blood-stained handcuffs before my starting eyes, and asking me in a way that left me gasping for breath if my initials were F.H. An eternity which I occupied in overhearing Ethel and the doctor carelessly plotting together to poison Kenneth, and in creeping on hands and knees down mile-long, dimly lighted corridors to and from a succession of scenes of horror. Finally I woke to see the sun shining in at my window, and to the dull realization that some of my dreams, at any rate, came uncomfortably near to the truth. Downstairs I found the Tundish, unshaved and unabashed, at one end of the breakfast table with a medical journal propped up in front of him, and Kenneth and Ralph at the other, each with a morning paper. I saw the doctor's eyes twinkle with amusement as I took my seat next to him, and he told me that he had been called out of bed again at 4 and had only just returned. "And what about the escort? Did he accompany you?" "No. I rang up the police station yesterday evening telling them that I expected the call, and they trustfully allowed me to go on parole." This fresh negligence on the part of the authorities seemed to rouse Kenneth's ire, for he jumped up from his breakfast and rang up Inspector Brown, reporting the finding of the notice and the doings of the night in aggressive, carrying tones that we could none of us fail to hear. Apparently his news did not meet with quite the expected reception, for "Will you please repeat what I have told you to Mr. Alport as soon as you can, and ask him to let me know when this abominable farce is going to end," were his final words, and he returned to his interrupted breakfast, glaring offensively at the doctor, as much as to say, "Damn you, now you know what I think about it." Then Margaret came in, and after a moment's obvious hesitation, which seemed to underline and emphasize her choice, she moved to the end of the table away from the doctor and took a chair next to Kenneth and Ralph. Thus we started out on the second day after the murder, already divided into opposing camps. The Tundish and I at one end of the table, Margaret and the two boys at the other, an uncomfortable accusing gap between us. And in our different ways, we each of us, except the doctor, showed the embarrassment we felt. He conversed with me very much at his ease, tapping the open journal in front of him with his egg-spoon to emphasize his forcible remarks, decrying the sins of the anti-vaccinationists and glibly labeling them as nothing but a gang of murderers, as though the word murder held no terrors and was the most natural word in the world for him to use, when the chances were that a murderer sat at the table and I alone of the four believed him anything else. I saw the three exchange glances, and Margaret murmured, "Murder will out," though what she meant by it exactly was not quite clear, but words held a fascination for Margaret apart from any meaning they might convey. Had a pretty head been equipped with brains, she would surely have been a poet. Folding up his paper, the doctor rose from the table, asking, "Has anyone seen anything of Ethel? Is she coming down for breakfast?" "I haven't heard a sound from her room," Margaret replied. "Still sleeping, I expect, after a broken night, which is not surprising. I'll run up and find out how she is." We heard her knock twice and again. Then she came back and stood in the doorway. "I can't make her hear," she told us with a queer little catch in her voice. Now Ethel had been safe when we woke her in the middle of the night, and we had all heard her lock her door when she returned to her room, But when Margaret made that simple statement, it sent her thoughts back to yesterday's breakfast, when Ethel herself had come tumbling into the room with a white face to tell us that she couldn't waken Stella. We looked at one another in dismay. Kenneth pushed back his chair and rose slowly to his feet. The doctor sprang to the door and raced up the stairs 2 at a time, and like an echo from the night before, we heard him hammering on a door. Then, to our infinite relief, we heard him asking, "Are you all right, Ethel? Would you like your breakfast sent upstairs?" I saw Margaret's eyes brighten unnaturally, and a tear rolled down her cheek. "Oh, how absurd of me," she said, and hurried away to hide her emotion. Kenneth and Ralph went out into the garden. The doctor returned and rang the bell for Annie, giving her instructions about Ethel's breakfast. Then he turned to me. "So you've had a fright, have you?" he asked quietly, and I felt myself redden under his penetrating gaze. "I did too," he added, mopping his forehead. "What a ruffian I must look, Jeffcock. I must bathe and shave and get to work. Thank God I've a busy day ahead." "Yes," I agreed. "You certainly have the advantage of us there, for we have nothing to do but sit about and jag one another's nerves. How on earth are we going to get through another day of this, possibly 2 or 3? It may all end sooner than you expect," he answered enigmatically, and with that he left me and ran upstairs. How was I to get through the day, I wondered. Sleep, smoke, write letters, slink about the garden, avoiding Ethel so that she should not learn of my ever-increasing doubts about the doctor. But there were 12 weary hours to while away. I would have gone into the garden and adopted Kipling's cure for the hump. Dig till you gently perspire. But I was doing that already. My thoughts travelled with longing to the tingling crystal air of Yorkshire's moors. That was where I would like to be on such a day as this, off for a 20-mile tramp with my pipe for company. But that was not to be, and with a sigh of distaste I collected writing materials and proceeded to the shade of the cedar to write some letters. Presently Ethel joined me. Her face was still swollen, the bruise beginning to blacken. She looked tired too, and I imagine had been crying, but her eyes lit up with something of her old smile as she came toward me, a letter in her hand. "Do listen to this," she cried. "Isn't it just like Mother? She's sending us a visitor now of all times, and someone we have never seen before at that." Mrs. Hanson's incoherent hospitality was a family joke. Visitors she must have. She had no discrimination in the matter of individuals and occasions and the way they might jar or mix. She would think nothing of bringing home a perfect stranger, august or otherwise, and feeding him on kindliness and cold mutton. And I will give her credit for this. The visitor, august or ordinary, the cold mutton, the kindliness, and the occasion would generally mix to a pleasantly affable blend. My own friendship with the Hansons dated from one of these haphazard invitations, so I smiled at Ethel reminiscently as she stood by my side with a letter in her hand. "A good thing too, perhaps," I said. "We shall have to sit up, mind the manners, and behave. Tell me more about it. What is it to be? Rich man? Poor man? Beggar man or thief?" Ethel began to read me bits of the letter. "You remember we were expecting to see my cousin Bill Kenley when he got home from Rhodesia. We were to look out for him next week on the Channel boat. Well, rather to our surprise, he arrived this week, yesterday in fact, and he surprised us still more by bringing with him a wife. They are on their honeymoon. Such a jolly girl. We both of us like her immensely. But poor things, while we were having lunch, a cable arrived for Bill, ordering his immediate return. Some native unrest that they fear may develop into serious trouble, and he must be on the spot. So he sails back again tomorrow. Meanwhile, what is his wife to do? She has no relatives here. I should have liked her to stay on here with us, but Dad takes all my time, and he doesn't want to be bothered with anyone else. So it occurred to me, why not send her down to you? You need a chaperone, you know. It's all very well while the whole lot of you are there together, but after the tournament you can't go on keeping house for the Tundish without the Manchester pussies getting their claws into you. So you may expect Janet, that's her name, soon after this letter. You'll be nice to her, I know. My family are really very good to me about backing up my wild invitations, but she's really very nice, and you'll enjoy having her on her own account. Dad is steadily getting more like his old self. He tells me to say how sorry he is to Miss Francis. I hope you're having a good—" "Oh, well, that's all that matters," Ethel finished, sitting down and fanning herself with a letter. "How am I to explain the situation to her, Francis, when she arrives?" "Just imagine coming to a strange house and finding yourself in the thick of all this." It certainly was rather a facer for Ethel, but I could not help seeing that the situation had its points. She sounds better than your Aunt Emmeline anyhow, and that's what you would have had to come to. As your mother says, you can't go on indefinitely without some older woman, and your aunt is the obvious elder. Now, the said Aunt Emmeline was a sister of Hanson, 10 years his senior, a spinster devoted to good works, and most uncomfortably and obtrusively high church. When Aunt Emmeline fasted, the recording angel and the cook were not the only ones to know it, and she managed to cast a gloom like a London fog over even the cheerful Dalehouse family. In short, she was one of those good women whose menfolk make friends with the devil. Ethel began to smile. Yes, Francis, as you say, there may be something to be said for the idea, but I don't relish the job of explaining the explanations. Oh, well, if she's a good sort, she'll see you need help. If she isn't, she'll help herself off, so it really doesn't matter. We left it at that, and after sitting with me for a while, Ethel went into the house to make ready for her guest. Apparently, Margaret stayed indoors to help Ethel, for I hardly saw her all the morning. Kenneth and Ralph paced slowly up and down in the shade at the side of the house. They paid very little attention to me, and I gathered from their manner that they were going over the facts of the case, much as I had done the night before. They would stand talking earnestly together and then resume their walking, only to stop and talk again a minute later. Once or twice they glanced in my direction. Then Ralph pulled a notebook out of his pocket, and they disappeared behind the garage. Kenneth was shaking his head emphatically as they went, and I could guess that he was deriding any suggestion of Ralph's that did not involve the doctor. I wondered if the two girls were carrying on a similar conversation, and thought how much happier we should be if the boys would behave more as Margaret did. She suspected the tundish, and to a less extent, I think, she suspected me, but like an ordinary reasonable mortal, she kept her suspicions to herself until they were confirmed. Rather shamefacedly, I got out my own notes and went over them again. Everything that had taken place since the compilation went to confirm the conclusion I had come to, and yet I was still unwilling. There was something fine about the... I put my papers hurriedly away. The boys were coming from the garage. They stopped in front of my chair, and I told them of the unexpected addition to our party. "Oh, Lord," said Ralph, "and a bride too. She'll smirk and say 'my husband' in every sentence." "You needn't worry, Ralph," was Kenneth's comment. "The bride will remove herself at once when she realizes the awful company she is in. Meanwhile, well, it's a diversion anyway. And talking of diversions, Chefcock, would it outrage the proprieties, do you think, if we rigged up a badminton court over there and had a knock or two? We could telephone for shuttlecocks." "Best thing you can do," I told them. "We can't sit about all day like this. We must do something." "Here's Margaret," said Ralph. "Come along, Margaret, and help us to make a badminton net. We've got some old strawberry netting. Can a gentlewoman's hand accomplish the rest with the help of a bit of clothesline and a needle and thread?" "Right," said Margaret, brief for once, and she retired to fetch a tackle. But just then the front door bell rang loudly. Through the open door and windows we heard plainly enough an authoritative voice alternating with a faintly protesting one. Evidently there was an argument between Annie and the owner of the commanding voice, the latter prevailing, for we heard it bearing down on us, and we looked at one another in dismay. "Good Lord, it's a Wheeler Cartwright woman," Ralph said aghast, "coming to be a mother to Ethel, and incidentally to lap up all the scandal she can." The voice was upon us now, and we rose to greet the owner, whom I had recognized as the mother of a meek and depressed little girl I had met at the tennis club. I had seen the mother on previous occasions too. Never once had I seen her silent. The irreverent called her Mrs. Juggernaut outright behind her back. "This is terrible, terrible," she breathed heavily. "I only heard the news last night, and I felt I must come round as soon as I possibly could do to express my sympathy with Ethel. Poor dear girl, how she must be longing for a mother! And tell me, is it really true that there is to be an inquest?" "I'm afraid it is," I murmured. "But, Mr. Jeffcock, what really has happened? The wildest and most disturbing rumors are flying about. Did the poor girl take an overdose of something? Surely it couldn't be suicide? The police are inquiring closely into the whole matter, and honestly I can't tell you much about it," I parried. "Mr. Jeffcock," she whispered, hostily impressive, and standing so close that I could feel the glow from her purple face, "is there any reason to suspect anything worse still?" "Really, I cannot tell you," I replied, in mimicking her pauses. "The police are very reticent, and they have asked us to be equally so." And with that I stared her straight in the face. Mrs. Wheeler Cartwright took a deep breath, and slowly her face acquired a yet more fiery tinge. For obvious reasons, she had not adopted the modern fashions. She grew and spread. There was an ominous silence. "I see," she boomed majestically. "I see, then, it is as I feared. And now, where is Ethel? Where is the poor child? This is no place for a young and She is resting, I believe," Kenneth interrupted. "And she wants to sleep, I think," he added hastily as Mrs. Juggernaut turned and made for the back door with the obvious intention of proceeding forthwith to Ethel's room. She waddled and puffed like a tug on the Thames, and in a couple of strides Kenneth was ahead, barring the way. "I'll tell her you have called." Mrs. Wheeler Cartwright was defeated, but she retired in good order. "Good morning, then, gentlemen. I'd intended to ask Ethel to come and stay with me for a few days. A young girl alone. People will talk, you know." "Whisper indecently is what you mean," I said, my manner succumbing to my anger. "But Ethel has a married cousin coming to stay with her today, so that's a little pleasure they'll have to do without." I thought she was going to burst. Ralph escorted her to the door into Dalehouse Lane. Ethel came through the drawing-room door and joined us. "Heroes!" she laughed. "If she had caught me alone, I should have had about the chance of a sickly sardine doing battle with a whale. She'd have packed my things and carried me off to a purer spheres. And now she's going the rounds of Manchester? The old gull." Kenneth, I noticed, had nothing to say to Ethel. She kept her face turned from him and ignored him completely. I felt intensely sorry for them both. A broken engagement, a building bird's nest wantonly destroyed, in all conscience an unhappy enough event. But in their case, what added distresses? And they were deprived of the solace of work and other grief-killing outside interests. Margaret appeared with a work bag and retired with the two boys to the proposed badminton court. Ethel and I took refuge from the sun under the kindly cedar, she with the Times on her lap, I pretending to write. "Busy, Francis?" she inquired presently, and I knew she was going to ask me the question I wished to avoid. "No, only killing time," I answered grudgingly. But she did not take the hint. She threw down the paper and sat forward so that I could not see her face, her hands clasped around her knees. "Francis, what do you think of it really? Honestly, you can't believe the Tundish capable of such a thing?" "I can't answer you. It's no and yes at once," I replied reluctantly. Her dark head bent lower. "You against him too?" she whispered. "No, that I'm not. I find it desperately difficult to associate him with murder, an association, however, that I find equally improbable when I think of you or any of the rest of us who were in the house that night. That's the trouble, Ethel. The evidence against the Tundish is so very much the strongest. I try not to believe that he did it. I know that I didn't, and that leaves, and I can't make out a case against one. So, like a circle train on its dismal round of repetitions, I come back ever to the doctor. The circumstantial evidence is pretty deadly. A prosecuting counsel would make a good deal of his previous acquaintance with Stella and his reticence on the subject. We know that he quarrelled with the father. The prosecution would suggest that she had the knowledge of some disgraceful secret in his past, knowledge which, if published, might ruin his career in this country, and that he took instant measures to silence her. Ethel sat, a picture of limp dejection, with her dark head bowed, her hair falling forward, a screen to hide her face. My suggestions roused no sign of quickening interest, and in spite of the conversation I had overheard at the club, I came to the conclusion that she knew no more of the doctor's quarrel with Stella's father than I did myself. And yet that conversation, what was it she had said? "I certainly would not have offered to put her up if you hadn't suggested it to me." A statement that surely must be pertinent to our pernicious tangle, and if so, what tragic thoughts were filling that dark brown head? But surely, Francis, no one could suppose him to have done it so clumsily. A doctor could so easily, if he wished, find a way that would not point so obviously to wilful murder. His own counsel would make the most of that point, of course. But anyhow, unless a real murderer is found, he will be under a cloud for the rest of his life. It's horrible, simply horrible. Ethel shuddered, burying her face in her hands. To think that a man who has never willingly wronged a soul can be put in the position he is in by nothing but chance and ill luck. I'm sorry if what I have said has made you feel still more unhappy, Ethel. Quite half the time I'm convinced that he had nothing whatever to do with it, and then at times my convictions fail me. There's just one thing, however, that strikes me as being in his favor. Has it ever occurred to you, I wonder, as it has to me, That he has just a tiny suspicion himself as to who did it?" Ethel turned in a chair and stared at me. "Do you mean that he suspects one of us in this house, you or me or any of the others? What makes you think so?" "I can't tell you," I answered. "It's just an idea at the back of my head, perhaps so vague that I should not have mentioned it. I have the impression, though, sometimes very strongly, that he could throw suspicion on someone else if he chose. Somehow, I don't quite know why, I feel that he is waiting for something, biding his time." We sat a while in silence. A light breeze had sprung up, a breeze laden with heat and the sweet, overpowering scent of syringa. A mowing machine droned a garden or two away. The air was saturated with summer scents and sounds, and we sat nursing our unhappy thoughts more in keeping with the rotting leaves and sodden undergrowth of some November wood. "What time does Mrs. Kenley arrive?" I asked after a prolonged pause. "Mother doesn't say, but I've been looking up at the trains, and there's one getting in just before lunch. The next good one is not till after 4, and I should think she will travel early to avoid the worst of the heat. Anyhow, we can't go and meet her." Annie crossed the lawn to us, salver in hand. "A telegram for you, Miss Ethel. Arriving 1:10, Manchester. J.K.," she read. Then, looking up at Annie, "Tell cook that Mrs. Kenley will be here in time for lunch." Annie departed. "What are you going to do about telling her the state of affairs, Ethel? Are you going to tell her?" "Yes, I must. Oh, surely I must. I shall wait until the afternoon, though. I think it might look as though I wanted to drive her away if I told her at once. But how I'm going— oh, how I hate it all." Poor Ethel was on the verge of another breakdown. I could see by the way she leaned back in a chair and turned her face away. I had wanted to ask her if she too had heard someone laughing in the waiting room before she came into the dispensary on the Monday morning when she came down from the club to get some tape for the handle of her racket, and to question her regarding that intriguing conversation of hers with the Tundish, which had come to my ears so clearly across the courts as I sat in the umpire's chair. I came to the conclusion, however, that she had enough to bear, and if she had answered me, I had by this time argued myself into such a condition of disbelief that any reply she might have made would only have given rise to additional skepticism and doubt. And so the unemployed and interminable morning wore on. I dozed in my chair and pretended to write. Ethel hardly stirred in a chair at my side. The two boys played badminton, but after a time their voices ceased, and I concluded that they were too overcome by the heat to continue their game. Margaret flitted past us several times, but she never once stayed to prattle in her usual way. She seemed preoccupied and worried. Shortly before 1 o'clock, the Tundish returned from his rounds. He joined us in the garden immediately and took a seat beside us. Ethel handed him the telegram she had received without comment. "And who, may I ask, is J.K.?" "There's to be another prison inmate," Ethel replied rather bitterly, and explained in a few sentences what Mrs. Hanson had done. "And what am I to say to her?" she concluded. "And what will she do when she finds out all this?" The doctor considered for a few moments. "When was the wire sent off?" he asked at length. 10:30 from London. "Then she had had plenty of time to see the morning papers. If not before she left the hotel at Folkestone, at any rate before she reached London." "The papers!" Ethel cried. "Is it in the papers already?" The doctor pulled a folded sheet out of his pocket. "Not in the Times," he said, "but the penny papers have lost no time in getting hold of it. Look at this." He pointed out a paragraph to her. I read it over her shoulder. It was on the front page and was headed, "Sudden Death of Young Tennis Player." "A sad event occurred yesterday in the old cathedral city of Manchester, where the annual lawn tennis tournament is in progress. Miss Stella Palfreyman, a promising young player, died suddenly during the night of the 16th. There is reason to suppose that her death was due to an overdose of some narcotic medicine. Miss Palfreyman retired to bed in her usual health at night and was found dead by her hostess in the morning. We understand that the police are inquiring into the matter." Ethel threw down the paper and shivered, her eyes filling with tears. "And tomorrow it'll be shouted and billed all over the place. I shall never be able to hold up my head in Manchester again. Oh, I can't bear it. I simply can't bear it any more." The Tundish took her hand in his and held it while he spoke, his other hand affectionately on her shoulder. "Ethel, you must not give way like that. It's ridiculous. Hold up your head, indeed. What have you to be ashamed of? Come now, I know how brave you can be. and we are all going to need all the grit we have got in the next few days. Now about Mrs. Kenley. She may be with us any minute." "Here she is," I said as the doorbell pealed. Ethel dabbed her eyes hastily and ran indoors, and I heard her greet the guest in her usual pretty way. She took her upstairs to her room, and I remember even then noticing the tones of Mrs. Kenley's voice and thinking of myself that they promised well. A few moments later, Ethel was bringing her to us across the lawn. I looked with interest to see what manner of person it was that fate had added to our unhappy household. Would she be capable of rising to the situation, or would she add yet another wrong note to our strident discords? Mrs. Hanson had spoken well of her in a letter, but Mrs. Hanson, I knew, and I don't say it unkindly, would have found some traits to praise in the devil himself. True, he did put the best silver sugar tongs in his pocket, but with what an air he had passed the sugar! I was reassured, however, as Ethel brought her guest toward us. I liked her at once. In a couple of hours I was definitely impressed. But I'm going too fast. Now, I don't mind admitting that as a general rule, and quite apart from any question of sexual attraction, I greatly prefer girls to men, and there is a certain section of the sex, a stratum lying somewhere in between the fussy and the fast, that to me seems to contain the salt of the earth. How clean they can be, these gay, good girls, clean in the mind and body, their dainty clothes barely hiding their intriguing beauty in a way that causes my 40-year-old heart to thump in its cage to see. And why, I ask, should the good and the beautiful be hidden away? God bless their shapely pink legs. How brave and bright they can be. Look at them in the tram or the train on their way to work. Look at them coming home again at night. Look at them, I say, and then look at a crowd of unshaved, sheep-faced men with their fusty, dust-clogged, hideous and idiotic clothes. Mrs. Kenley, I could see at a glance, was neither fussy nor fast. She was younger than I expected. Whether she had bought her clothes from Paquin or through the weekend advertisement columns of the Daily Mail, I do not know, but to my male inexperience she seemed to be beautifully, fittingly dressed. I had an impression of a short skirt and slim grey legs. Then a pair of grey and extraordinarily wide-awake eyes held me mesmerized, and I found myself being introduced. Was she beautiful? At the time, I'm sure I could not have answered that question, but I knew at once that she was brave and true. The gong sounded before we had time for conversation, and we went into lunch. Margaret and the boys followed and were introduced. I sensed at once that the presence of a stranger went far to lessen the feeling of awkward restraint that seemed to engulf us when we were all together. No reference was made to the tragedy during the meal, and we had as yet no idea whether Mrs. Kenley knew of it or not. I was dreading that she would ask some question about the tournament. She must have been rather surprised, I thought, to find us all at home for lunch and not in a tennis kit. The Tundish, however, seemed to have anticipated the difficulty and guided the conversation with subtle skill to her life in Rhodesia and the voyage to England. She told us that she was not South African born and had spent most of her life in England. So the meal passed pleasantly enough. When it was over, the doctor announced his intention of taking, if possible, a couple of hours' sleep, and he advised us all to do the same. Ethel and Margaret retired to their rooms, Kenneth and Ralph to the drawing-room to play chess, and it fell to my lot to entertain Mrs. Kenley, a fate which I welcomed with secret enthusiasm. I took her to my favourite spot, the shade of the cedar, and Annie brought us our coffee there. We smoked cigarettes and for a time talked of nothing in particular. She was entirely at her ease, but I still felt the disturbance of that first look that had passed between her eyes and mine as Ethel had brought her to us across the lawn, and while I regarded her as closely as I could without appearing to be rude, I added little to the conversation. She smoked a cigarette in pensive contentment, and I fell to wondering why one look from a pair of clear grey eyes should have set my blood a-tingling and made me wish for all manner of unpleasant happenings to overtake the unoffending cousin Bob. Certainly Mrs. Kenley was charming, but I had met plenty of charming girls before. Margaret and Ethel were both that, and they both looked you straight in the eye without these disturbing bristles. Disturbing, but very refreshingly disturbing, and I think that for the first time since the murder my thoughts wandered contentedly in pleasant places. Mrs. Kenley put down her coffee cup on the grass by her chair, and hitching it round to face me most squarely, asked me in a low-pitched voice, "Now, Mr. Jeffcock, will you please tell me all about this terrible affair?" Of course, I saw it in the papers on my way here this morning, and one paper mentioned that Miss Freeman was staying with a Dr. Hanson. I can see that things are in a bad way here. You would naturally all have gone home by now if you could. So I suppose it means that you are being detained by the police? Is that so?" I nodded, and she continued. "I wondered if I ought to change my plans and go elsewhere, but I remembered that Mrs. Hanson really seemed to want me to come and chaperone Ethel, and so I thought I would come on for one night at any rate to see how things are. Tell me now honestly, what do you think I ought to do?" "I hope you'll stop, Mrs. Kenley," I answered promptly. "It would be a real kindness to Ethel if you will. I'm sure she will ask you to stay when she gets a chance to have a talk with you." With that, I told her about the whole miserable affair from beginning to end. Stella's tragic death, Ethel's rupture with Kenneth, the ugly suspicion that had fastened on the Tundish and more or less shadowed us all, of the feeling of subtle distress that seemed to fill the air, and all the wretched series of events of the past 2 days. True, little Alport had instructed us to be reticent, but Inspector Brown had surprisingly agreed to visit her, and if she were going to stay in the house, there seemed nothing to lose by telling her the facts, and little possibility of keeping them secret. I was glad to have somebody to talk to, someone who by no possible juggling with keys and time and facts could have had anything to do with Stella's death. I was amazed at the ease with which she grasped the whole situation and at the pertinent questions she asked. At the end of an hour's talk, she knew all that I could tell her of the murder, of other matters, of how charming I thought her, of how beautiful I thought the curved arch of her pencil brows over those wide grey eyes, of the adorable little trick she had of pushing out her dainty but determined chin when she wished to emphasize a point I could not tell her in so many words, and whether she guessed anything of my feelings I do not know. But I think that even then we both of us realized that the foundations of friendship had been well and truly laid. We sat talking together until nearly 4 o'clock, when Ralph and Kenneth, the former arrayed in a very grubby tennis shirt and ancient flannel trousers, dusters, and a tin of polish in his hands, interrupted a tete-a-tete. "Going to polish up the bus," Ralph explained, "and there are 1 or 2 little matters I want to look into as well. Are you interested in motoring, Mrs. Kenley?" "Yes, I am. I used to drive for the Women's Legion during the war." "Really? And were you in France at all?" Kenneth asked. "Not for very long. I drove an ambulance for a few months, and then I was drafted to London and drove for the War Office." I could see that Mrs. Kenley was not over anxious to talk about herself, and she made a move toward the garage as though to close the conversation. But the boys were interested and pressed for details, asking whom she had driven and whether she had had any interesting experiences. "No, nothing exciting at all, except just once, and then—" She paused and smiled reminiscently. "And then I hit a certain well-known general in the face." "Did you really, though? And why weren't you shot at dawn?" Ralph laughed. "Please tell us about it. What did happen?" "Oh, there's really nothing to tell. I wish I hadn't mentioned it. He was a little drunk, and, well, I suppose he took me for someone else. I was in an awful fright next morning because I couldn't afford to lose my job. But nothing happened all day, and at night when I took the car home I found a big bunch of roses tucked away inside with a note of apology. He was a sportsman after all." "What was his name?" Ralph asked, but Mrs. Kenley merely laughed and shook her head. "That, Mr. Bennet, I am keeping for my grandchildren. Now, please show me the car. I love to look at new ones with all the latest tricks." We went to the garage, and soon she and Ralph were deep in technicalities. The unventilated garage was stifling, and not being interested in young Bennet's opulent car, I soon left them to it. As I strolled back to the house, I heard a raucous voice proceeding apparently from one of the upper bedroom windows. It was Cook, and Cook in no amiable mood. At first I could clearly hear every word she said. Then, just as I was getting really interested in what I heard, she moved, and I missed the rest. So I says to myself, it may be all right, and maybe not, and there ain't no reason as how it should be wrong. But seeing what happened afterward, the police might like to know what I saw if I was to tell them. But then I think to myself, it may be better worth your while, Cook, I thinks, to keep it to yourself. And the police, they ain't no friends of yours, Cook, I says to myself. Now then, what do you think about it? Cook gossiping with Annie was my first conclusion, but Annie appeared with a tea tray before I reached the house. I heard no more, excepting a few slurred and indistinct half-sentences. I felt certain she was, if not drunk, not sober. But not drunk or not, it was evident she had seen something of which she had not told Alport. Intending to go round the corner of the house and go to the door in the front garden wall to see if there was a newsboy in sight from whom I could purchase an evening paper, I approached the house pondering, a pastime at which I was fast becoming adept, pondering the question, which of a party could cook have been addressing with such drunken garrulity? It certainly had not been Annie, and I had heard no answering voice. Her words had been spoken with a half-drunken lurching inconsequence. Was it just possible that she might have been talking to herself? Ethel, I'm sure it's dangerous. There can't be any real difficulty in getting rid of her. I'm sure we ought to take the risk. It was the doctor's voice, and I walked full tilt into him and Ethel round the corner of the house. My shoes were fitted with rubbers which made no sound on the hot plastic asphalt path, and though I had heard every word the doctor said, it was obvious that they had not heard me. He was standing with his back to the wall. She was facing him and very close, his hands on her shoulders affectionately, hers holding on the lapels of his coat, her dark bobbed head tilted back and looking up adoringly to meet his downward gaze. I felt myself go hot with shame, yes, and anger too. The hussy, the inconsiderates. Had they no sense at all of fitness or time? Surely Ethel might have waited until Kenneth was out of the house, even if her engagement to him had been a fundamental error. The Tundish, a real mate, and if her conduct struck me irreprehensible, words will not describe the sudden surge of indignation that I felt against the well-balanced, placid doctor. Ethel sprang from his embrace, flushed scarlet, then pale to a sickly white. My own embarrassment almost equalled hers. The Tundish never moved a muscle or turned a hair. He greeted me at once, pleased to see me. "Hello, Jeff Cock. You have just come in time to help us decide about the dismissal of Cook. I am for prompt measures. Ethel for tomorrow and delay." But why should she go tonight, Tundish?" Ethel stammered, slowly recovering from the shock of my sudden arrival. "Dear gods, Jeff Cock, what won't these women stand for the sake of having a thing labelled cook in the house? Why should she go tonight? Why? And you can ask me that after all you have just been telling me. She's near enough to being drunk, isn't she? And as I was saying, I'm sure there's no risk of any row." Ethel said nothing. Her colour had returned, but I thought she looked bewildered and confused. The doctor turned to me, explanatory. "She's afraid that she might not consent to go without a fuss, that we might get a crowd round the house if we had to turn her out." "Yes. Oh, yes, I'm sure we should. And I couldn't stand it. I can't stand any more. I can't stand any more." Ethel cried hysterically and slipped past me round the corner of the house. The doctor shrugged his shoulders. The sooner all this is over, the better it will be for Ethel. About at the end of a tether. He took me by the arm. I wished him anywhere else except with me. Never had I liked him less or distrusted him more. I was still feeling the awkwardness of my unfortunate intrusion, uncomfortable, half apologetic, wholly angry and disturbed. But he, not only had he hidden his feelings, I began to wonder whether he had any feelings to hide. A rock, Ethel had called him, an iceberg rather, and like an iceberg, God alone knew what lay hidden away below. God, and perhaps some poor devil of a steamer that strikes the cruel projections unawares. He went on talking to me. What did I think of Mrs. Kenley? He would feel happier about Ethel now that she was here. I barely heard him, but I did hear him say again, "We must get rid of her. There isn't any risk." And then poor drunken cook, standing at the bottom of the stairs, nodding her head grotesquely, her greasy wisp of hair waving to and fro. "I knows what I knows, Dr. Wallace." The gong sounded for tea. We had it on the lawn under the cedar. Ethel poured. Ralph never spoke a word throughout the meal, and for once Margaret was quiet. Mrs. Kenley and the doctor did the talking and made the conversation. They played catch with it, and Janet, Mrs. Kenley, was as good at the game as he was. Lightning work they made of it, vivid, and Kenneth represented the thunder. He glowered, and I felt like an invalid does when some friendly meanwhile stays too long. I wished them both Forgive me, Janet, but I really did say anywhere. It was a ghastly meal, a meal to choke on. The Tundish relieved us of his presence as soon as tea was over. The rest of us sat on, but the Ethel-Kenneth rupture still cast its gloom, and I think we all felt that Mrs. Kenley had been a godsend. She was telling us of some of the golf courses she had played on in South Africa, idly prodding the turf with the point of her parasol, when she suddenly bent forward, peered closely at the grass, then straightened herself, holding a tiny glittering fragment between finger and thumb. She examined it carefully. "Anyone lost a diamond?" Margaret, who had sat so listlessly inert that I had glanced at her curiously more than once, sprang to her feet. "It's mine!" she cried. "It's mine! I lost it sometime this morning, and I've been searching for it everywhere." "But what an extraordinary piece of luck to find it out here like that," Ralph remarked. "You might have gone over the lawn with a tooth-comb 100 times and not have found it." "Yes, but remember where I come from," Mrs. Kenley laughed. Ethel, who had been into the house, rejoined us at the moment, and Margaret ran to show the diamond to her and tell her of its recovery. "Why, I didn't know even you had lost it. Why ever didn't you let us know? We would have organized a search party at once. I shouldn't have been so quiet about it if I had lost a stone that size." "I should have done that at any time, my dear," Margaret answered. "But it seems so petty to make a fuss over the loss of a paltry diamond when things were so— you know what I mean." "Well, I'm awfully glad you found it," Ethel said, handing it back to her. "And now, Janet, if you can spare me a few minutes, I want to consult you about something." They went indoors arm in arm, and the four of us were left. Kenneth suggested bridge, and so we whiled away the time until dinner. That meal was so abominably cooked that we left most of the dishes untouched and satisfied a hunger on bread and cheese, which Ethel, in high annoyance, told Annie to fetch. "What will you think of us, Janet? And on your first night, too?" "Oh, please don't distress yourself on my account. I prefer bread and cheese to roast beef on a night like this." "It's quite all right, Ethel dear," Margaret soothed. "They say you don't want so much meat in hot weather. Don't they, Dr. Wallace?" Our dinner of bread and cheese completed, the doctor betook himself to the consulting room again, and after a little manoeuvring I found myself alone with Mrs. Kenley in the garden. As my doubts about the Tundish grew, I felt an increasing disinclination for a conversation with Ethel, and on the other hand, I had no wish to ally myself in any way with Kenneth and his open hostility. Margaret, I shrewdly suspected, was more than half inclined to think that I might be the criminal myself, and it seemed that to Mrs. Kenley alone could I look for ordinary, unhampered conversation. But I had no sooner succeeded in my object than Annie came to inform her that she was wanted on the telephone, and she hurried away indoors. I waited with what patience I could, but she did not return, and after a quarter of an hour or so I followed in search. She was in none of the downstairs rooms, and I concluded that she must have gone to her bedroom. The boys were playing chess in the drawing room. Neither the girls nor the doctors were to be seen, and after glancing through the evening papers, I went back to the garden and its rapidly lengthening shadows. I was nearing the garage when I heard voices. Ethel and Margaret, I thought at first. Then I recognized Mrs. Kenley's pleasant, low contralto. Then that the other voice belonged to a man, a deep, mellow voice, a voice belonging neither to Kenneth nor Ralph nor the doctor, but still half familiar. Surely not Alport, I thought, but it was. As I rounded the end of the garage, there they were seated close together on the little bench at the far side of it in intimate and earnest conversation. She was persuasive, leaning toward him. "Very well then, Janet, I'll agree, but I'm not at all happy about it," I heard him reply. Then they looked up and saw me. Mrs. Kenley blushed and withdrew a little along the seat. Then they whispered to each other, and little Alport rose, said good night, made a funny little grimace at me, and hurried off through the garage gates and into Dalehouse Lane. I was staggered. Mrs. Kenley stood up, troubled, her grey eyes full of concern, meeting mine unflinchingly. "Has he been bothering you too, then?" I thundered. "Don't make such a noise. I have something to tell you, Mr. Jeffcock," she said, ignoring my question. "Come and sit down here, where we shan't be overheard." I went and sat by her side on the bench where only a moment before the ridiculous little man had sat, and I perceived that, while she had sat close to him, she kept a distance from me. All my original animosity against the conceited little detective returned. Mrs. Kenley continued to look at me oddly. "I suppose you have guessed something about it?" she queried. I stared at her. An idea was beginning to form at the back of my head, but it seemed altogether too fantastic. "You know Alport?" I ventured at length. "He sent me here." "He sent you?" "No, I don't quite, Mrs. Hanson." "Mrs. Hanson has never seen me. Listen, it's like this. Mr. Alport wanted further evidence which could only be obtained by someone staying in the house, someone whom none of the rest of you could possibly suspect of having any connection with the police." "Then you're not the wife of Ethel's cousin, Bob Kenley, at all? You're a—" "Yes, I am she said, quietly amused. "But Mrs. Hanson's letter, did he forge it?" "Oh, no, she wrote it right enough, but at his request. He went down to Folkestone last night and sent me a wire before he started, telling me to hold myself in readiness. We came to Manchester together this morning, and he gave me full details on the way." "But he couldn't have got to Folkestone last night in time for Mrs. Hanson to write." "Oh, yes, he did, though. He went by aeroplane from here, explained the whole affair to Mrs. Hanson, and persuaded her to write the letter. That was why he made you all promise that you wouldn't write to anyone mentioning the murder. He was afraid Ethel and the doctor might think it peculiar if Mrs. Hanson didn't come back from Folkestone, and he wanted you all to remain here just by yourselves and no further additions made to the household." I had to admit that Mrs. Kenley had played a part to perfection, but somehow I didn't quite like the idea of all being bottled up in Dalehouse for her to play the spy on, and I think she understood my feelings, for she turned to me with a deprecating little gesture. "I'm sorry, you do see that it was the only thing to do. And as for me, well, I had to obey my instructions. And now why does Mr. Alport want me to know?" "He didn't. If you hadn't caught us together, we shouldn't have told you anything, though I'm not at all sure that it hasn't turned out for the best. I may as well tell you that we're all in some danger. Mr. Alport wanted me to leave the house tonight and to break up the house party right away, but I persuaded him to let me stay until tomorrow. Why does he think the danger greater tonight than it has been hitherto? You know he took away the bottle of poison? Well, the analyst has found it to be nothing but water." "Water? But Stella—" "Yes, it was poison then. But the trouble is, where is the poison now? Was it thrown away? And if not, well—" I could only stare at her stupefied, and the doctor's words to Ethel about there being no risk in getting rid of Cook seemed more sinister than ever. "Alport had no right to take such a responsibility," I said at last. "It isn't quite so bad as you might think at first. The poison has a bitter taste and a strong smell. Miss Freeman, of course, took it unsuspectingly, and would naturally think nothing of it if a medicine had an unfortunate taste. Besides, there's no real reason, so far as we know, why the person who gave it to her should harbor murderous designs against anyone else. I don't understand it at all. It's a complete mystery. I never could see why anyone should have murdered her. Apart from the doctor, perhaps," I added, remembering my own growing suspicions on his quarrel with her father. "Well, I don't think I'm justified in telling you any more. I wish to tell you just as little as possible. But I'm very glad to have someone at hand to help me at a moment's notice if an emergency should arise." I sat for a time and thought. To say that I was surprised at the revelation would be to put it too mildly. I had been pleased to imagine this grey slip of a girl at my side as clean and free, a breath of sweet outside air refreshing the exhausted atmosphere of some hot, unventilated room, a ray of light piercing the shades of deceit and hypocrisy that seemed to have engulfed us, and here she was, with one unknown exception, more involved in the wretched affair than any of us. Never had I seen anyone less like imagination's picture of a woman detective, neither hard-eyed, brazen and tight-lipped, nor of the vampire siren type familiar to frequenters of the cinema. "Well, I think that you must be very brave, and I'll do my best to help you if I can. But tell me, is this sort of thing your regular work?" "No, I've done a good deal of it from time to time, but I'm not officially attached to Scotland Yard. Mr. Alport lived next to us when we were children, and we grew up together. I can see that he's not exactly popular with any of you here, but in many ways he's very fine. I've seen a side of him that you have not. When my husband was killed, just before the armistice, he was the best friend imaginable, and has helped me ever since. When I was demobbed, I went on the stage for a time. I wasn't much good. Had a pretty hard time. Mr. Alport used to find me odd jobs in connection with his detective work. Not very often at first, but lately I've helped him quite a lot. We sat behind the garage talking together for some little time, and I learned that her real name was Janet Player. She told me many things of Alport, always to his credit. She was loud in the ugly little man's praises, and when I learned that he was married and the father of a family, I trust they took after the mother, I disguised my dislike, and apart from actually admitting him an Adonis, agreed to most of what she said. The light was fading when we rose to go indoors. The sun had scorched its way across the sky and set, and now behind the house and over the northwest garden wall the air was aglow with its last refracted golden rays. In the east the cathedral seemed to have advanced by half its distance, so clear did it stand with the paling green light behind it. The rooks were cawing their pleasant raucous lullaby among the neighbouring trees. The thrushes were at evensong. The cedar stood out in dark but shadowless, enhanced relief against the dimming light. Did the quiet beauty of the scene make your heart beat a little faster too, Janet? I wondered, as we stood side by side at the top of the garden slope looking down at the old Georgian house with its wicked Borgian secret. This twilight half-hour, how even the 10,000 repetitions of experience failed to rob it of its mystery and subtle sense of calm bereavement. Day a-dying, night engulfed, and were you wondering what the night might bring, Janet, as you stood like some slim grey wraith at my side? And did you vaguely guess that the man at your side, champion sob-stuffed sentimentalist that he is, was all astir, quickened by the garden's evening beauty, by your calm, brave spirit, by the pity he felt for you fighting alone in this dangerous house, and that Cupid was fitting arrow to bow and preparing to shoot? We were halfway down the slope when she put her hand on my arm and stood intent. I thought I heard someone, she whispered. Someone in the lane, most likely. No, it was quite near, a rustling of leaves, like someone brushing along against the hedge. We stood for a moment, a hand still on my arm, but not a sound disturbed the still air. There was no breath of wind to stir a leaf. Janet shrugged her shoulders when I suggested that it might have been a cat, and that we had spoken so low that we could not have been overheard, and we walked across the lawn and went back into the house together. We found Margaret, Kenneth, and Ralph sitting in the drawing-room. "Ah, here you are at last," Margaret greeted us. "Isn't the garden lovely in this light, Mrs. Kenley? Isn't Ethel a lucky girl to have such a beautiful home?" Ralph urged a game of bridge. There were 5 of us, and Janet stood out a letter to write her excuse. At a little table near the open doorway we settled down to our game, Ralph partnering Margaret against Kenneth and myself. Margaret had the most astounding luck and backed it with good play. Twice they made Grand Slam, rarely less than 3 tricks. They registered rubber after rubber. "Never mind. Unlucky at cards, lucky in love," Margaret giggled. Kenneth scowled, but she seemed to be blissfully unconscious of having dropped a brick, and added sentimentally, "I sometimes wish that I wasn't so lucky at cards." I murmured something inane about there being plenty of time for luck to change. Kenneth yawned openly and suggested bed. "Where can Ethel be all this time?" Margaret asked as we gathered up the cards. "The naughty girl hasn't been near us all the evening." I should not have been surprised had she come out with, "Best to be off with the old love before you are on with the new." But that we were spared, and having collected her knitting, she went off to the consulting room, saying, "I shall scold Dr. Wallis for keeping her so much to himself." Janet came downstairs as we were going up to bed, and I took time to caution her to lock her room door. She nodded emphatically. "I will. And more than that, Mr. Alport has given me a bolt, a set of screws, and the wherewithal to fix them." The end of chapter 12.